Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live podcast. We're really glad that so many people have chosen to join us. What I want to talk about today is the way in which early modern societies dealt with epidemic disease. And in this case, I mean plague, and in particular, from about a century after the first appearance of plague, i.e. the Black Death, in the mid 1300s. And looking at what goes on from 1450 until the last major outbreak of plague in Western Europe. A whole range of regulations developed in northern Italy, especially Florence, Milan, and Venice in the late 1400s. And these focused on three key areas: prevention, containment, and eradication. So the first thing a society needed to know was whether there was plague present, that is, a positive testing regime. This was through death certificates. Cities required a medical person to attend every death and list a cause. If it was plague, an outbreak was declared. When a neighboring city or town had an outbreak, other measures came into effect to prevent its spread into your town. Thus, all goods and people from anywhere within an outbreak were quarantined on arrival. 40 days from the Italian for 40. Why 40? Because it was a biblical number. Jesus was in the desert and tempted 40 days and 40 nights. The Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years. It was a number connected with purification and cleansing. How did you know someone came from an outbreak? Well, this period also saw the development of passports. When you went somewhere, your paperwork noted arrival, departure, and if there was an active outbreak during that time. These health passes became unnecessary in the 19th century in Europe, which is why no one ever mentions passports in literature and why immigrants show up in New York never having papers. Passes were brought back during World War I as a security measure. Assuming all of these efforts to prevent failed, which they usually did, and plague got into your city, what then? Containment. Anyone who had plague, visually and symptomatically tested positive, was sent to the plague hospital, and those near them, their contacts were isolated, usually in shacks near the hospital, but sometimes in major outbreaks, the infected and their contacts would be confined to their home with the door nailed shut and food delivered via baskets. This all sounds very sensible, but the infected were often put 4 to 5 to a bed in the hospital on straw mattresses, which were rarely changed. The chances of cross-contamination and secondary infections was very high and undoubtedly increased fatalities. On the upside, you got a diet rich in meat and meat broth. If you lived 40 days in the hospital and recovered, or made it 40 days in an isolation shack without symptoms, you were released. But how did the town get rid of plague? Not just stop it and contain it, but cure it. This gets to ideas about what caused plague. First, plague was a punishment sent by God to a people or community for sin in their midst. As the illustration reminded believers, God smote the Jews with plague in their exile for their idolatry. So the first thing to do was to clean the place morally. So close the brothels, drive out the prostitutes, punish non-believers and heretics, the sort of people and behavior likely to enrage God. Second, bad, that is smelly air, caused disease by miasma, any disease. Specific diseases did not have specific causes. So bad smells such as tanning had to be eliminated. So some types of industry were shut down. Then you provide good smells. So houses of the infected were fumigated with rosemary, incense, and other nice smelling things, while the inhabitants were quarantined. Finally, once a disease had appeared from bad air, the specific disease might be contagious, as plague was thought to be. So it was essential to stop things that might spread it. People were already being quarantined in the hospital and isolation shacks, but dogs and cats with their fur infected with plague moved freely about, entering living spaces. So often there were attempts to eradicate them. However, an equally important consideration was controlling the population. This went from ensuring adequate essential workers to controlling movement, to most importantly, preventing panic. First, the hospitals needed to be staffed. Medical workers were needed to identify the infected, guards were hired to control access points, that is, check health passes, which required a level of literacy, and enforce quarantines and isolation. And there was a significant and difficult policing problem, as I'll discuss in a moment. Restricting activities went from banning church services, which was problematic, as one of the ways to appease God was through processions, services, singing, and prayers. Baptisms were banned or limited to godparents only. Weddings were curtailed, especially the partying element. Funerals were forbidden. The scale of death usually meant people were simply buried in mass trenches. All these control measures required a host of informants to spot outbreaks, identify contacts, enforce limits on gatherings, etc., which produced a lot of paperwork. Plague outbreaks are some of our best documented events in the 14 and 1500s. Finally, it was essential to stop social breakdown. This was a real issue. If bad air was the problem, then get to where the air was good. Flight wasn't just commonsensical, it was medically recommended. But if all your bakers fled, your town starved. So people had to stay in place, and if their labors were necessary, continue working, baking and distributing bread, the best example. Fleeing could result in fines and loss of civic privileges and rights. However, this was problematic. In larger states, monarchies like England, France, Scotland, the elite simply left. King and Parliament went to Oxford or Perth if there was an outbreak in London or Edinburgh. The ability of governments and ruling elites to relocate without fear of consequence, rather than stay and act, in part explains why larger states were very poor at enforcing or funding the full range of responses, especially permanent health boards and purpose-built hospitals. City-states didn't have much of a choice. Their elite didn't have anywhere to run. Kings, nobles, MPs could flee to fresher climes, though I've not read of any bundling their wife and children into a carriage and galloping around the countryside to test their eyesight. And of course, find someone to blame. If God was angry, it was easier to find the focus of his anger in the other than in oneself. Hence, Jews were largely blamed for the first outbreak of plague, the Black Death of the mid-1300s and later in the 1300s. As a result, most Jews were expelled or massacred, except in the Papal States where they were protected by the Pope. Not for altruistic reasons, but largely because there was a line of theological thought that required Jews to be ever present as a reminder of what happened to a people who rejected Jesus. So if you've ever wondered why there were so many Jews in Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Western Russia in the 1930s to be targeted by Nazis, it's because the massive Polish and Lithuanian monarchies welcomed Jewish refugees in the late 1300s, fleeing genocide in the West. Around 1550, nearly 75% of all Jews lived in Poland, Lithuania, because of its toleration. But this all sounds good in theory, but it didn't always work that way. In practice, families often undermined the regulations. No one wanted a family death labeled as a plague death, as that meant being moved to the hospital or isolation shacks, which were, with some justification, seen as death traps. And no one wanted to have their empty homes visited by fumigators who might pilfer. This was a significant concern, as essential medical workers were usually very poor and foreign because they were the only ones willing to take on the task. And everyone knew once the outbreak was over, they were fired, driven out, in any case, forgotten and unwanted. Many people, therefore, in their individual and personal actions, undermined and circumvented the regulations. Your house needed to be protected. Your neighbors needed to be fumigated. You needed to be cared for at home. Your neighbor needed quarantine and isolation. Interestingly, the response in Islamic countries was radically different. There, plague was a test of faith and charity sent to a specific individual and family, not a communal punishment for sin. European travelers in Muslim countries always noted people didn't flee. The infected were cared for at home by their families, and the death rates were much lower. But as these were unbelieving societies, there was no reason to learn from them. Finally, the cost of these regulations were enormous and remind us they were developed in the richest parts of the West in the mid-1400s, northern Italy. Milan was able to build a permanent hospital only to be used in times of plague, which could house 1,200 patients. Bearing in mind plague came usually every 10 to 15 years, you can see from the Leiden etching, this is a big expensive building to be largely unused for a decade. Also keeping literate guards, medical staff, sanitation workers, health boards year in and year out was also expensive and produced an enormous amount of paper. So most places just threw up shacks and barns as hospitals and did their best to implement the regulations as and when needed, and when not, just hoped for the best. It's worth considering in a bit more detail why societies as a group liked the regulations, but individually and as families often actively worked against them. People were genuinely frightened of quarantine and isolation. They feared for their property and livelihoods, and the scale of death was enormous. This bill of mortality was, in effect, a poster, and these were put up, in this case, all over London every week, at a time when the city's population was about 450,000. In the week shown, nearly 3,000 Londoners died of plague, and a further 1,000 of something else, in a week when only 122 were baptized. In the end, during this 1666 outbreak, over 100,000 Londoners died. It's that scale that threatened panic and social collapse. How do the surviving 350,000 bury the 100,000 dead bodies? They were simply dumped without ceremony or remembrance into pits and trenches, lime poured over them to dissolve the flesh, a bit of dirt, and the next layer. There's a reason why Italians refer to plague pits as lasagna. People were truly terrified, but often took individual action based on their own understanding of what was best, even when it was against the law. So fleeing both bad air, miasma, and infected people, or their contacts, contagion, made a lot of sense. But it also was likely to spread and prolong the outbreak. Being sensible and obedient was, in theory, something everyone agreed on, but in practice, individuals could always find reasons why, in their case, exceptions needed to be made. The result, from about 1450 to 1720, most urban areas in Western Europe had an outbreak every 10 to 15 years and lost 10 to 30% of their populations. Each time, the regulations were brought into force and enforced with varying degrees of effectiveness and individual compliance. In practice, there was no real medical understanding of what was going on, so the real usefulness of the regulations was keeping societies and economies from collapsing into panic and flight. Did the regulations work medically? Not really. Socially and economically? Probably. I'll end with the last great European outbreak of plague in Marseille in 1720. The state sprang into action with quarantine regulations, and the army sealed off the city and surrounding areas. Food supplies were placed in a no man's land to feed the quarantined inhabitants. In the end, the plague didn't advance, but in that one summer, about half the population died. In autumn, when the disease always abated, the army went in and found bodies in plazas piled 10 to 20 feet high. They were shoved into crypts under the church, lime flushed into the crypts. They were then sealed, and so they remain to this day. But Marseille, the great port city of France, survived and recovered. Thank you very much. And I think Nicole will do a bit more housekeeping and we can take questions.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Bill. That was fantastic. I hope you guys all enjoyed that. We're going to move to the sort of question and answer portion of the event just now. So there are two ways of doing that. There's a lot of people are joined in today, so you have to bear with us a little bit. You can either raise your hand and then we'll call on your name to use the microphone to ask your question. Or if you prefer not to use your microphone or your camera, you can just type your question into the chat and we'll answer it that way. So it's entirely up to yourself. Just bear in mind maybe a little bit of patience, because it could be quite a lot, I think, for us to get through, but we will do our best to get all of them. So please just start asking away. I've got Dr. Casper. Do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. We actually had a grand round here recently about pandemics and how the Chinese authorities dealt with the Manchurian plague of 1910. That was a pneumonic plague, which before the presentation I did not know anything about other than the bubonic plague. And apparently they did some of the same techniques in terms of prevention and treatment as they do now, and based on your talk, as they did in the 14th century. And I just wanted your opinions about some of those things.
Well, one of the things I find, again, could everyone just turn off your microphones? Right. So one of the things I find really fascinating is that although we have modern medicine in the sense of vaccines and antibiotics and things like that, most of the actual governmental regulations for dealing with an epidemic disease are pretty much the same now as were developed in the 1400s. And they haven't changed a great deal. And I think in part that's because a lot of their aims are very similar. They are in part about controlling the disease, but mostly they're about keeping a society from just sort of falling apart in the face of panic. And they seem to do that very, very well. And you're right. There was an outbreak of bubonic plague that in some cases became pneumonic in the late 19th and early 20th century. That actually there were cases of it in Glasgow. There was an outbreak in San Francisco, and then also, as you say, in Manchuria. But time and again, you see the same methodologies being used. And I think that's because they, even if they're not necessarily perceived as able to deal with the medical problem, they do deal with the societal and economic problem, which is the danger of collapse.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got another question from Robert Davidson. You want to go next?
My question is about what do you think the significance of Nostradamus's new kind of view on like the plague and how to treat it in the 16th century?
Do you mean Paracelsus rather than Nostradamus?
No, Nostradamus.
Okay, I don't know a great deal about Nostradamus. Paracelsus obviously is a radical change in the way medicine is done at the period. The basic understanding of all disease in this period is that it's caused by air, and that the body is the result of four humors and that they need to be kept in balance. So that tends to be the discussion that you get in all of the medical literature until you get Paracelsus coming along and basically saying it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with minerals and things like that, and proposing a different kind of approach. They are in all forms what we would probably consider to be a more homeopathic response rather than a modern medical response. I'm not sure that answers your question, because I don't know a great deal about Nostradamus other than as a prophet.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. We've got a question in the chat, which is, what do we learn for today's plague?
I think that in a sense, a lot of the basic regulations still make a great deal of sense, and that's why we still use them. I mean, if you can look at what we're already doing. So if someone is ill, they have the disease. If it's bad enough, they're put in a hospital, and everyone around them is either quarantined at home or in some outbreaks is put somewhere else. That makes sense because you're trying to stop a contagious disease from spreading. So you need to break the chain of contacts. But I also think that coupled with that, and something I don't think that we have talked about too much because we haven't had this experience in a very long time, is that these ways of sort of shutting down societies, which were the norm in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and well into the 1700s, have enormous consequences for the functioning of the society. And you can imagine that a lot of what was considered to be early modern industry was simply shut and stopped, and trade stopped when you had a plague outbreak. But these societies were used to that, so they had systems that sprang into existence very quickly. So you had very often the price of bread was immediately controlled, bread distribution was set about, sometimes even rationing was brought in. There was an understanding that by inhibiting your populations and their ability to move around and function as normal, you also had to have a flip side of that, which was to care for the entire population, not just the sort of people that were ill. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from Louise James. So Louise, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, just coming online. Hi.
Hi.
I think that's so fascinating. Thank you. And it sort of provides a level of comfort that all this has happened before, because of course it feels very new for us. But my question is, if there was social media back in the day and that immediate sense of communication between people and individuals, do you think there'd have been any sort of different response? Or are these key tenets of how governments dealt with plague, would they remain consistent?
I think that's a good question. And I think that one of the answers to that is partially because in my presentation, it's slightly misleading. I regularly talk about urban areas in the early modern period, and London in the 1660s was 450,000. But most of these cities are in fact towns. They're populations of 10 to 25,000. You don't need social media. Anything spreads really, really quickly. If you've ever lived in a town of that size, you know how very quickly information gets around. And these are very compact places as well. And that does mean that the danger of panic is so much greater. And it also explains why the danger of scapegoating is so much a feature of responses, not just state responses, but quite often popular responses to a plague outbreak. You know, they look around. So Catholic countries look for Protestants, Protestant countries look for Catholics, everyone looks for Jews, everyone looks for prostitutes, everyone looks for sodomites. They're convinced that someone is to blame for this. And the rumor of someone being in one of those categories moves very, very quickly through what are relatively small communities. And even London of 450,000, in actual fact, it's a collection of boroughs. And these are fairly tight knit. They are places where everyone knows everyone else's business.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll go to one of the questions in the chat just now. We've got what evidence from Eleanor, we've got what evidence is there of how quickly the plague traveled to different countries? And would it mainly have been via particular trade routes? For example, the Silk Roads or pilgrimage routes?
Once it becomes endemic in Europe after the Black Death, which is obviously coming in from the eastern side and then sweeps through the Mediterranean, up Western Europe, through Scandinavia, and then sort of finishes in Central and Eastern Europe. Mostly it's localized outbreaks, and then it moves along trade routes. And neighboring towns are affected. And although I said that, you know, an urban area might be hit every 10 to 15 years, that doesn't mean every urban area in a country will be hit the same 10 or 15 years. Very often you will have an outbreak in in a cluster, and the neighboring area won't be affected at all. And that's one of the reasons I think why they keep using the regulations for centuries, is because they don't know anything about the disease medically. They perceive that the regulations sometimes work, and as a result keep using them. But it's almost always following trade routes, and ports are particularly bad for starting outbreaks, and that's largely because a plague has an incubation period that on foot makes it more difficult to spread, but by ship it makes it easier to spread, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Bill. So we'll go to another question on the microphone now. We've got Elizabeth Lancaster, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. You said that the plague reappeared every 10 to 15 years, up to about 1720. In your last response said that wasn't everywhere all the time. So did it just fade away after the early start of the early 1700s, or did something else happen? Why? I just wonder why you stop at 1720.
Well, it's a fantastic question. I stop at 1720 because that is the last big outbreak that's really identifiable anywhere in Western Europe. It's one of the interesting things about the plague is we don't quite understand why it goes away. But if you go to most countries and even most urban areas, they can tell you when the last outbreak was, and it will have been as virulent as any other outbreaks. So there is something about the disease itself that is different. The sort of simple answer is we think it mutated. That's problematic. There are people who would suggest it's because the population became increasingly immune kind of through natural selection. But the problem is that, you know, the death rate seems to be more or less consistent all the way through. There's some discussion about the move away from timber construction to stone construction creates a different built environment. But northern Italy was basically always stone anyway, so that kind of doesn't explain it. So in other words, there's lots of possible explanations, but none seems to satisfy what we actually see. In some ways, the scariest thing is it kind of just went away, and we don't actually know why, which does imply it could just come back. But I mean, we know a lot more about bubonic plague, and bubonic plague is relatively easy to treat. And I know most people won't be aware of it, but for example, there's 7 or 8 cases every single year in the US because it's endemic in the prairie states, in the prairie dogs and other kind of wild animals. So people get plague every year in the United States, and we don't freak out about it.
Great, thank you very much, really helpful.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a question in the chat from Ailey. She says she knows there was some positive impacts on society as a result of the plague in the 14th century. For example, people gaining wealth as land was cheaper and working conditions and wages improved. Do you think we'll see some positive impacts on society today?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the reality is that the population of Europe in 1400 was probably half what it had been in 1350. That freed up an enormous amount of land that had been used to produce cereal for bread, can now be used for animals. It can now be used for fruit. It means that labor is in demand, so tenant farmers can now demand better rates from their landowners, or they'll just threaten to move to another area, that sort of thing. So the reality is that if you lived, you were probably, in worldly terms, better off. You were probably also suffering from something very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, because masses of your fellows had died and had been sort of dumped in ditches, sort of thing. So yes, they are better off. If positive impacts today, it's hard to see. There's lots of suggestions that, you know, for years we've had lots of companies that have said, for example, in hiring of the disabled or people wanting to work from home, well, working from home doesn't really work for us, and there's a legal justification for why they can say that. And somehow we've all found out that we may not like working from home, but we have managed to do it a lot more than we ever thought was going to be possible. Whether that's a positive outcome or not, it's certainly an outcome. I'm not sure that answers the question, but it's just some thoughts in the midst of an outbreak.
Thank you very much. We'll go to a microphone question. We've got one from Dr. Torres.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Right, right, Bill. It's you've answered really my first question, which is largely about the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's one ancillary part there, which is the role of air transport and massive urbanization. If you had any comment on that. And then the other thing is looking ahead to future pandemics, which are waiting in the wings, and I don't doubt they are. Have you any comment about the lessons of history for them?
As someone who studies it, what I've seen going on around me nowadays hasn't particularly surprised me. Lots of people obey the regulations. Lots of people don't obey some of the regulations. What is interesting about this epidemic, I think, is that unlike previous ones, we really don't yet understand this disease very much. So we don't know whether it gives immunity. We don't know whether it's seasonal. And those are really important questions when we think about what's going to happen in, say, the next 9 to 12 months. So in a sense, that makes it seem much more like an early modern situation where they thought they understood the disease, but in functional terms didn't understand the disease. But interestingly, bubonic plague does confer a certain amount of immunity, usually for 6 to 9 months, though they thought it conferred a longer immunity. So if there's anything I think that would be useful for governments in speaking to their populations, is to make clear that regulations are in part about protecting people from the spread of a disease, but they are also in part about keeping a society together and to keep it from falling apart. And I don't think that has necessarily come through as strongly, because we've taken a very medical scientific approach to the explanation of why we're doing what we're doing. So, for example, if we had more of an emphasis on this is about keeping our society together and our fellow human beings, from losing their job and stuff like that, things like the furlough scheme would be much more prominent in our discussion. And yet somehow that just kind of sits there in the background. And yet, if you think about what that's managed to do, it has kept an awful lot of people in their job rather than unemployed. That is a part of what the early modern world understood to be the responsibility of the state. And they made that very clear that that was a responsibility of the state in an epidemic. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that goes a long way towards it. And
okay.
future lessons to learn from that, obviously. Good. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Okay, we'll go to the chat now. We've got one from Douglas. And he says, you explained the medieval and early modern Christian world saw plague as a punishment, unlike the Islamic world. Leprosy was, of course, common in medieval Scotland, Europe. That appears to have been treated as an opportunity to show Christian charity to the afflicted. Can we explain the difference in approach to the two diseases?
Well, there are some differences, but there are some similarities. And I think one of the big differences is leprosy was never on a scale that plague was when plague showed up. It's very interesting that leprosy disappears from Europe about the same time that plague appears. In fact, most of the early plague hospitals are actually abandoned leper houses, which raises all kinds of questions about what leprosy was in the medieval period. And there's a lot of good literature that suggests it's not always what we know as leprosy, Hansen's disease, but that it could be other things, and that it could sometimes be associated with the actual sinfulness of a given individual. So there are some similarities and there are some differences. I think the biggest thing that makes it easier to show Christian charity is just the sheer scale of it. And the fact that leprosy, although it was understood to be something that killed a person, it didn't kill him in a couple of days. And that again is a big difference. So although you had lepers and you had leper houses in medieval areas outside of a town, you didn't have pits of people being filled up with leprosy. I think had you done so, you would have seen a different response. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you for that. We've got a microphone question from Mary. Mary, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. I am asking that question from Kenya, Nairobi.
Oh, lovely.
Yes, because we have been, and being a history teacher, I was following you very well and actually realizing, it's something that has been going on in other parts of the world in different forms, just like we have had different forms here in Africa, and we have had to go this way and that way. But my question is, most of these epidemics, they seem to have a certain concentration. But now this COVID-19, before even it landed in some of our African countries, we're getting grants to prevent it, and nobody has even understood what it is. There's no scientific research like they were doing in the early days. They would put the healthy people into a task to make sure they explain the thing to people so that there's not this kind of fear that people have. And as they are paralyzed to not do anything, I'm afraid we are having many people without food, without jobs. Their whole life has been completely put in confusion. They're not dying like the way the other plagues do, but they will die in masses because they will not die of COVID, but there will be so many complications that people are getting now. So what can we do to help, especially this continent where I live, for people to understand? Because the media has thrown too much and there's so much confusion. So I'm asking, how can we do it and do it better so that the people, especially this continent, will come out with such sense of saying we can live again, we can do it again?
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about the kind of global response is that the response to COVID-19 has been global, and in fact, in the plague period. So if plague broke out in southern France and you heard about it in central France, you didn't swing all of the regulations into existence that day. Now that tended to be that eventually it got there, and then you did. I think because we live in a globalized world, what has happened is that lots of places have swung into existence at the same time. Now, longer term, the question is will that have saved lives? And it's quite honestly, the jury's out on that. It's hard to tell, and that's because we just don't understand this disease enough. We don't understand its impact on urban areas with high population density as opposed to rural areas with low population density. But if you say, for example, look at rural areas in the United States now, and where you are seeing quite rapid spread of the disease, it seems that it is able to get into a rural area and bite deeply. It just takes a lot more time. There seems to be a relationship to whether an area is densely populated and also very mobile. So major travel hubs have been particularly badly hit. Major tourist areas, northern Italy is a perfectly good example of that, have been particularly badly hit. I think that where there have been the real problems. So, and I think this gets to the kind of question you got as well. If you look at the difference in the response, say most of Europe to say the US, most of Europe took the decision that the best thing to do was to keep people in jobs and effectively to take over their salaries by the state, or at least heavily subsidize it by the states. The US's approach has been to say, what we're going to do is deal with this through unemployment. So they'll lose their jobs and then they file for unemployment. Now, both of them in a sense are the state supporting the individual, but one has considerably more psychological stress involved with it than the other. Because if you're sitting there thinking, I've been furloughed, I have a job, the future's a bit unsure, I'm a bit worried and things like that, you're still thinking, but I have a job. If you've just been told, go get your unemployment check, you're sitting there going, okay, I'm getting unemployment, but what's going to happen to me?
Yeah.
Because unemployment's not forever. I have to get a job. Is there going to be a job? So I think there's sort of differences in the level of stress in how a culture deals with it. And one of the things, and I was stressing this in one of the answers I already gave, these early modern societies understood that you had to keep your society together. You had to keep it supported and sustained. And that meant feeding people who didn't have food. It meant trying to keep businesses there so that when the plague went away, and again, this is a big difference. In the early modern period, you knew that come November, plague was going to go away because plague is seasonal. So you knew that if you were really unlucky, you'd get 6 months. And if you were really, really unlucky, it would come along the next summer and the next summer. But very rarely did plague hit more than 3 summers in a row, and very rarely for more than 4 or 5 months. So because of that, you kind of had a sense of stop and start, and you could see light at the end of the tunnel because you knew November was coming. And I think what we're sitting here doing at the moment is going, we don't know whether once we get to the end, have we got are we past the beginning of the first wave? Is there going to be a second wave? When's it going to happen? What's it going to be like? That lack of understanding of how the disease works is extremely stressful, and it does make, from the point of view of governments, it much more difficult to know what to do. I hope that kind of helps answer the question.
Yes, very much. Thank you. Very much. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for that. So we'll go to the chat. We've got a question from Yuri, who asks, what is your view regarding the political use of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as in Latin America, where governments justify the use of police force to control populations to stay home? Also, it seems that racist governments in Latin America disregard the right to health of indigenous communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Well, the reality is early modern communities, they don't even have police forces. They quite often have a civic guard. Largely, their job is to walk along the walls at night and to stand at the gates and give the alarm. But during plague outbreaks, they tended to use the guard a lot more, and they could be used very ruthlessly, though it normally wasn't necessarily with a political view in mind. However, when it comes to your question about indigenous communities, this idea of scapegoating or deciding that some people in the community don't deserve to be part of this, we're all in it together, let's keep things together. It's slightly different in Western Europe, because what most cities tended to do with people they didn't want to care for and is they literally just pushed them outside of the walls and said, go away. They threw them out. So it is slightly different than in a comparison, because you're talking about large geographical areas and modern nation states, and they are different. I think part of the question that you're also getting at is this concept of how healthcare is provided and to whom healthcare is provided, and it is very interesting the different way in which particularly European states where they all have some form of universal healthcare have been able to kind of marshal and control and organize things in a very different way than, say, in the US, where you have not only some people without healthcare, but when they lose their job, they quite often lose their health insurance and now find themselves without healthcare. And that's creating a different kind of response and questions about who and who doesn't get and how they're prioritized and things like that. So there's a whole host of issues there. I think if you're looking for an explanation for what is going in Latin America towards its indigenous communities, it's 300-400 years of racial ideas about those communities is simply finding yet another way to manifest itself in an unpleasant manner.
Thank you for that. So we've got a microphone question from Amanda.
Oops.
Amanda?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh,
Can
okay.
you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a totally fascinating talk and your answers to the questions. I've lived and worked in France most of my life, so I was absolutely fascinated by what you said about Marseille and how they dealt with their plague. I wondered if you'd heard of a big expert doctor in Marseille right now who's predicting all kinds of things, including a notion that we ought to look to the southern hemisphere and what's happening there now to know how it will be in Northern Europe come November, December. I wondered what your view was on that. He's particularly talking about New Zealand, where they said they were totally clear of cases and now have clusters again. It's a question which interests me, not just because I'm living in France, but most of my family and my daughter are in the UK. I wonder, should we have hopes for the future in treating such theories?
I mean, I often think that even looking at New Zealand is problematic because it is an island. It is well, two islands. It's distant. It is not a sort of transportation hub. In other words, where lots of people are milling about and going in different directions and coming from different directions. And even the clusters they seem to have had largely seem to be as a result of incoming rather than community transmission. I think there's a more interesting question about the southern hemisphere is now in winter. We're in summer. So far this disease doesn't seem to be seasonal, but it may well be less problematic in warmer months simply because people are not as confined. Their buildings, their rooms are not closed and things like that. Though I've also read some stuff that says, whereas, for example, in southern US, this might be problematic because people are actually shut in with air conditioning in southern states, which is actually circulating unfiltered air enthusiastically around a building. So I don't think we're in a position to know what winter is likely to be like. I think a lot of that will depend on the extent to which you have largely eradicated community transmission before winter comes around. If we've got rid of community transmission, it is a lot easier to deal with an outbreak, a flare-up, as a result of something that's coming in from outside than trying to deal with widespread community transmission. But it does mean vigilance, and it is almost certainly going to mean localized lockdowns, and it may require borders being shut and all kinds of things like that. My personal view is that I don't think that this is going to really cease to be much a significant concern until we're looking at some sort of a vaccine, and that's likely to be 9 to 12 months in a happy world. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It does, indeed. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
That's great, thank you. And we have another question in the chat. This is from Georgios. He asks, we've seen a lot of bad examples of scapegoating and people blaming. However, there's also been encouraging examples of mutual aid and community level support. Any evidence that there was a similar pattern in the past? And which of the two would you say dominated in the past and which one is predominant now?
Yeah, the reality is that the expulsion and wiping out of Western European Jewry was particularly bad example of scapegoating. What became interesting is what happened after that, because there weren't Jews to blame. And so the kind of scapegoating became in some ways a lot more bizarre, in that it really was, let's just close all the brothels and that'll deal with the problem, or let's close the bathhouses quite often because they were associated with prostitution, or close the taverns because they were associated with prostitution. So you get a focus on smaller things, but I think throughout the period that I study, there are a lot of encouraging examples. I mean, these urban areas hold themselves together, facing death on a scale that we cannot even comprehend. I mean, the Spanish flu was nothing like an outbreak of a plague in the early modern period, because you are really talking about losing, if you're lucky, 10% of your population in a summer. And if you've got a bad outbreak, you're probably going to lose over a third of your population. And that could be in the summer. So worst case scenario, for example, if COVID turned into something like bubonic plague in Aberdeen, by the end of this summer, we would be looking at, 60, 70,000 dead. Now, the fact that those societies cope with death on that scale and come out the other end still functioning, still holding together. I mean, they're not pleasant societies, they're unequal societies. There's a lot of poverty and things like that, but they're still holding together. I think it is a testament to the fact that by and large they understand they either sink or swim together. And in fact, most of the people breaking the regulations tend to be the elite, because they can afford to break the regulations and they can afford to pay fines.
That's great, thank you. We've got a microphone question again, and it's from Gershon. Do you want to ask your question?
I'm listening this from Nairobi, Kenya.
Hello.
Hello. Now, my question is, what lessons have we learned from history, as you have narrated from 1400s to now, and what we are seeing? Have you learned anything that is helping us to cope with the situation at the moment?
I think it's difficult to expect our modern world to have learned from the lessons of this period because of modern science. To the extent that we understand modern medicine with antibiotics and things like that, and vaccines and things like that, even the Spanish flu predates that. So you're really talking about the first mass pandemic on a global scale to hit a world that is used to relying on modern medicine to defend it and to stop things dead in its tracks. And so I think, although we can look at the past and we can say, they did things that worked and stuff like that, the reality is we're not used to looking at the past for responses to medical problems, because when you look at the past, by and large, their response to medical problems was crazy because they didn't understand how disease worked. So it isn't in our nature, even at a governmental level or at a personal level, to look to even the early 20th century and say, how would they have dealt with this medical situation? Because we would just look at them and go, but how they dealt with all medical situations was weird because they didn't have modern medicine. So in that sense, it's a new environment for us. If, on the other hand, you say, how do we learn from history about keeping a society from falling apart and to stop panic, then we should be looking to the past, but we have to look really to the distant past, because again, we aren't used to societies breaking down in panic outside of wartime. So we understand refugees during war, and we understand black markets during war, and we understand all of that sort of stuff, but that's wartime. This is a peacetime situation where we are expecting people to behave in ways that on an individual level, they might look at and go, this isn't good for me, but it's good for everyone. And that's not something we're particularly used to doing. So we're having to learn to do it. And to be fair, most people seem to have learned to do it. And that's encouraging. When we see, thousands and thousands of people cheek by jowl on a beach, that's very discouraging. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. In the chat, we have a question from Clive asking, there is some suggestion that autoimmune systems in some react dramatically and successfully. Is this the reason why some of the plagues died out?
As I was saying, it's just not, there isn't anything in the literature that has satisfied everyone for an explanation for why plague eventually disappears in Western Europe, and indeed seems to disappear most other places. It's endemic still in places. It's endemic in the Rocky Mountain and Plain states of the U.S. It's endemic in the steppes of parts of Russia and Mongolia. So it still exists, and it's certainly related to the original, the one that killed so many people in the West, because we've been able to do DNA sequencing from plague pits and things like that. So it's similar, but there seem to be some differences. So there's some epidemiological and now DNA research that might suggest that there was a widespread mutation that resulted in the disease becoming less virulent and therefore simply just disappearing. It may well be in the modern world have to do with the fact that we're just much less in contact with the kind of fleas that carry plague and pass it on as a result of feeding off of infected animals. So there's not an answer, is I guess the short answer to your question.
Okay, we've got a question from Hamish. Do you want to ask your question? Sorry, that was Hamish. You want to ask a question? Perhaps changed his mind. We'll move on to our question from the chat then. Steve asks, has it been suggested that he said that regarding the demise of plague in the early 18th century, has it been suggested that this might be related to the spread of the brown rat at the expense of the black rat, which also occurred through Europe during the same era?
Again, this falls into the category of no one's really happy with the explanations, because the relationship between brown and black rats doesn't seem to coincide neatly with the appearance and disappearance of plague in various parts of Europe. So it may play a part. My own personal view is probably a lot of these things play a part, that the relationship of rats and their frequency in close proximity to people, changes in the mutations in the disease itself, changes in urban sanitation, probably all of these, and maybe even immunity through natural selection in the population may well have played a part. But it's not possible to sort of nail any of those down in a way that seems to make anyone particularly happy.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Piers. The Black Death outbreak in mid-14th century affected rural society as well as urban society. Was the reaction different in rural areas?
Well, so this is a very interesting question, because first of all, subsequent outbreaks of plague don't affect rural society. Plague after the original outbreak really becomes an urban disease, and that has all kinds of interesting problems with how we understand what the disease is doing. Rural society doesn't seem to react any differently. The reality is during the Black Death, there was a lot of flight because there weren't regulations. Urban areas, rural areas simply didn't know what to do. And it does appear that in the original outbreak of the Black Death, the plague was not only circulating in its bubonic form, but probably in its pneumonic and septicemic form, and those have much higher death rate. I mean, pneumonic and septicemic, you're about 90% likely to die if you get it through that route, as opposed to bubonic, where you have probably, even without medicine, about a 50% chance of recovery. But so the original outbreak is very different in all kinds of ways, but in many cases, whether it's urban or rural, there's a lot of social collapse. And I think that's why one of the things you get in the development of these regulations is an emphasis on holding societies together.
Thank you. Jay asks, do you think that the talk of a second wave is credible?
I'd be surprised if it didn't happen. I mean, it happened with swine flu. We tend to forget that because it didn't turn out to be as bad as everyone feared it would be. But in actual fact, the second wave of that was much worse than the first wave. But we were just kind of blasé and used to it and better prepared for it. So I think yes is the short answer. I think what's going to be interesting is to what extent we see the end of the first wave.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from S. Kinmund. They say the millennial generation have proved that they're not snowflakes after all. Is the improvement in intergenerational understanding and the sense of society rather than individualism likely to last?
Well, it would be nice if it did. I don't know if it will. I mean, if we're going to look at my period, urban areas went back to being more or less what they had very quickly after plague went away. And sort of 10 to 15 years gives you a chance to forget that one awful summer or two summers. And they forgot fairly quickly, and life went on more or less as it had done. And it may well be that we return to the way it was before, but we may not. It depends on whether it's possible, in a sense, from a legal and regulatory situation, for us to return to anything like normality. So that may actually have a longer effect in the short to medium term, if we find that we have to keep some form of social distancing. That could change society in a quite dramatic way.
Okay, we've got another question from Douglas. He asks, does the historical record in Scotland reveal at point in the 18th century that people and the authorities started to think as plague outbreaks as something that happened in the past, rather than a disease that could reappear at any moment? Basically, when did they realise in Scotland that the threat of plague had passed? Did the town council in Aberdeen, say in, for example, 1780, ever think that a plague outbreak was a possibility? And where 18th century Scottish lazettos in port towns, sorry, a new word to me, on the watch for plague? Thanks.
Certainly throughout the 18th century, they are still checking past certificates and house certificates and things like that, and they're looking for, I don't think you could point to a time and say, right, you realize it's not coming back, but I think it was generational. The generation that remembered plague was still afraid. The generation who had parents and grandparents that told them of what plague was like still kind of worried. Probably by the early 19th century, for most people in Western Europe, plague was something that they knew about historically, but not through any sort of experiential or word of mouth, oral history sort of thing. But of course, it's also important to remember that it wasn't like these societies didn't have regular outbreaks of stuff that killed people in large number. I mean, there was still cholera, there was still typhoid, there was still, at least through most of the 18th century, smallpox. So the diseases, there were lots of diseases to kill people. But I think that certainly by the 19th century, most people associated plague as being something that happened elsewhere in the world and that didn't happen very often. And certainly it was a shock in the late 19th and early 20th century when bubonic plague reappeared in Western countries. But even then, it was a very limited outbreak, but it came as quite a shock.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Robert. Considering the bubonic plague has been around for thousands of years, could COVID be an old disease that was just dismissed as a bad cold back in days where the medical knowledge and technology was subpar?
I mean, COVID-19, by its very name, it gives you the clue. It is in a category of viruses that circulates widely, that includes influenza, that includes the common cold. Is this one that maybe has circulated and just never exploded? Could well be. Is it a version that has jumped the species barrier? That seems to be slightly more likely. I mean, the simple reality is that as we have more penetration into areas of the world which effectively we haven't before, and have more contact with animals, and animals are kept in a different and quite unhealthy way, and the chances of interspecies jumping is something that concerns everyone. And up to this, I think if you looked at what the World Health Organization was saying, the real fear was that we were going to get a mutation in something like a flu that was going to be something we weren't really able to deal with. It turned out it wasn't a flu, but it was something fairly similar.
Okay, we've got a question from, let me see, Aldrich, who asks, it's quite long, so I'll get through it. It says, I know you mentioned mainly cities as major areas for organising a response for plague. In the United States, particularly the South, have what can be called an aversion to authority and a preference to decentralised rule. Europe, by contrast, is highly centralised in response, like you mentioned with the Marseille outbreak. My county in Florida instituted a mask law to help prevent spread, and every county is different in their rules for punishment. My county instituted fines and call-ins for businesses not complying with the laws. Is a centralised response better overall, or is a decentralised response better, considering that decentralised rule could be better accepted by the people living in the area who may resent an order coming from a few thousand miles away?
I think in this circumstance, it isn't about where the orders are coming from. It's whether your population perceives that orders are things that really ought to be obeyed, and that they are willing to rely on their authorities, regardless of whether they're near or close, as telling them the truth and actually working in their best interests. So, you know, so, for example, you say that your county has instituted it. Well, that is very decentralized and very close, and you would expect then everyone in the county to behave. My guess is that probably isn't the case. So I think a lot more of it has to do with the way in which the population responds to their governments, whether they are near or far, and the way in which they understand whether the government is working in their best interests or not. I think that to a large extent explains the behavior.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions that are in the chat. Has anyone else got a question they'd like to ask? You can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat now. No, I think that's us. So, Bill, thank you very, very much for your presentation today and for the time you've taken to answer all these questions. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone will agree with that. We are recording this session as well, so we will be putting that out when we can to everybody. And just a huge thank you to you, Bill, and to everybody else for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.